all should be very worried. And the pressure needs to remain very strong to give any chance to real diplomacy here. I do think we need to come back to what are the real stakes here. And I think that while it's true that you can look at Iran's missile program, it's defensive missiles, it's true, that's all they've got, et cetera. But I also think it's a mistake to say that's what the people who are in this country who are opposed to those, to the diplomacy, to the diplomatic approach, that's really not the problem. You know, there's an illusion that Iran somehow represents an existential threat, certainly to Israel, maybe to the whole region, and maybe to the whole world. There's this constant repetition of the false claim that Iran is the worst perpetrator of state-sponsored terrorism against individuals. It's simply not the case. If you look at numbers of cases by any rational examination, that simply doesn't hold up. If Iran were to reverse its current position, the position it's held, as Larry said, since 2003, something acknowledged by all 16 of the US intelligence agencies, that Iran doesn't have a nuclear weapon, isn't building a nuclear weapon, and hasn't even decided it wants a nuclear weapon. And the supreme leader in Iran has said that it would be a violation of Islamic law to have such a weapon. And we can say, well, that's kind of ridiculous. But in the Iranian context, that is not ridiculous at all. Once something is deemed to have a religious significance, either positive or negative, that's a very hard thing to reverse in Iranian society. So that's very important. So if you put aside all of that and say Iran was going to have a nuclear weapon, even then, it would not be an existential threat to Israel. Israel is the one country in the region, not Iran, that has an actual nuclear weapons arsenal. And what Iran would threaten would be the nuclear monopoly of Israel, not the existence of Israel. That's not how it works in the real world. So all of these things are exaggerated, are created whole cloth in some cases, because what we see in the region is a set of regional competitions for who's going to be the regional dominant hegemon, if you will, in the Middle East region. And that largely has come down in recent years to the fight for influence between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And if you look back historically, earlier than that, 20, 30, 40 years ago, you could see that in the Middle East, there were only two countries that had the capacity to be indigenous regional powers in that way, Iran and Iraq, meaning they had size of land and population, they had wealth from oil, and they had water. Only those two countries had all three. The US goes in and destroys Iraq through a dozen years of crippling sanctions, and then takes out its leadership, destroys its military, and leaves the country shredded. And then you have Iran, which is no great friend of the United States, and vice versa, since the Iranian Revolution of 1979. Although if you ask Iraqis, it goes back to 1953, when the US and the Brits orchestrated a coup to overthrow the legitimate elected government in Iran and imposed the Shah of Iran, who later was overthrown in the revolution. If you look at all that, what you're looking at is a very classic fight for regional power. And the US has picked its side. It's picked its side, and its side is Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, and some other Arab countries, but basically those three leading an anti-Iran coalition. The 4 years of the Trump administration were 4 years of building this anti-Iran coalition, whose key weapon was the imposition of these absolutely crippling sanctions that the only reason they were not as lethal as the sanctions for 12 years in Iraq was that the country of Iran had not yet been destroyed by the United States. And it was a wealthy country. So it was somewhat better able to handle the impact. But you now have in Iran people dying because they can't get cancer medications, people dying because the hospitals can't get the equipment they need because of sanctions, and children dying of malnutrition, which is unheard of in contemporary modern Iranian history. That's on us. That's on these sanctions. And for all that people here want to say, well, that was the Trump sanctions. This is over now. First of all, it's not over. They have not been ended, let alone the nuclear sanctions. These new sanctions are still in place. And number two, what Larry said is crucial here. These are American sanctions. They're not Trump sanctions versus Obama sanctions versus Bush sanctions versus Biden sanctions. These are American sanctions. And the Iranians, understandably, are treating them as such. So the first thing you have to do is stop the violations of the nuclear deal that we have imposed. Then you can ask Iran to stop violating the terms that it said very carefully in a very calibrated way. We're going to start violating these agreements because there is no longer a viable agreement because the US pulled out. That's where we have to start.